What I didn't realize was I didn't know enough about the H-1B lottery and how disappointing it is. Because 6 months later, startup's founder in Silicon Valley emails me and says, Mark, I got to talk to you. And I pitched him on building a team in Canada. And I'm like, oh, good. You're ready for that team of engineers in Canada? He's like, well, no, someday. He's like, I have a different problem. One of our top engineers is from Mongolia, lost the H-1B lottery a third time. And we don't want him to go back to China. He's like, do you know anything about Canadian immigration? And I was like, yes. I'm like, do you need a work visa? He's like, yeah, can you get a work visa? And I'm like, and then employ the worker from Canada? I'm like, I just did that 6 months ago. And I go back to the same immigration lawyer. He's like, oh, another one. This one sounds great. Qualifies. So 4 or 5 weeks later, the work visa is approved. And then it dawns on me. I'm like, wait a minute. I think there's more people who need this service. And then I started asking more people in the immigration space. And then they're like, Mark, the US lottery, strike 3, 10,000 plus people every year. They go back to home country and they lose everything.
Welcome back to another episode of Area 51. What's up, Sanjay?
Nothing much, man. I mean, we're all into Canada these days, with maple syrup and maple leaves.
Yeah, it's kind of sad. We said this exact same things for the last episode. Shows how little we know about Canada.
And I'm hoping today's guests can educate us a little bit more on some of that stuff.
Yes. We are into another episode of our Canadian-themed series on what to do if your H-1B is not picked. And Sanjay and I are extremely excited today to say hi to Mark, who's the founder of Syndesus. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I think there was a time when Sanjay and I both like, hey, have you checked out Syndesus? It looks like a great option for tech workers. And we both knew because Mark and his team have been doing such an amazing job. We've seen all their content. We've heard testimonials from folks. So I'm excited to know more about Syndesus and educate all of you as well.
Happy to share.
So let's start with your background, Mark. We've seen your posts. We've seen your content. I'd like to know a little bit about you. Was this always something that you initially wanted to do? Or I know that you grew up in the West Coast in California. So do you mind walking us through your journey on what triggered Syndesus and what got you to where you are right now?
Sure. I guess to start, you're right. California native, born in San Diego, moved to Silicon Valley in 97, right when .com was on the way up and there's all the excitement around what was possible in Silicon Valley. I basically moved from San Diego to San Francisco, slept on my best friend's couch, and started talking to tech companies. And I wanted to be in sales. I don't have a tech background. I got a business background, but somehow I talked my way into a sales job selling Visual Basic documentation tools to developers. I didn't know Visual Basic, but I taught myself it very, very fast. And then I'm cold calling developers saying, oh, you don't want to document your code. I got a really easy way to do it. And from there, then I was selling tech from that point on. I wanted to be there. I thought that's the center of all the action. And I ended up spending decades in the Bay Area in tech. I think it was 7 VC-backed startups in my career in Bay Area and also in Canada.
Wow. So you're part of, I'd classify like Silicon Valley royalty, Silicon Valley history, because I think the only era that you've probably not had is, the chips or whatever, the Intels in the 60s or something, right? Because just you've been there, you've seen the ups and downs all over. Like, because I've heard stories with, companies registering a domain name and then going public the next day for like $1 gazillion.
See, that's the good news when people go up like that. There's a flip side, which people don't want to share, which I'll share with you. It's the company I'm working with. It wasn't mine. I was on the team there, but they went public, peak of the NASDAQ. I think it was April of 2000. They hit the NASDAQ Hall of Fame, opened up 25, closing at $92 or $95 a share. And all of us were like millionaire on paper. But then there's a lesson people don't tell you until afterwards, which is you sell every one of those shares. And I was just like, oh no, I got to borrow money and buy more shares. This company's amazing. And then over time, it went from $95 down to 25 cents and delisted. And I'm like, oh, okay, so this is how it goes. Not a huge win, but Great lesson.
So you pretty much knew how the crypto markets were. Like, oh, I've seen this before, right?
People were talking crypto to me and I'm like, no, I'm good on you. Go for it. But I'm like, I'm not touching it. No way.
That part when Mark's telling us about, I just learned Visual Basic really quick and I'm trying to sell it sounded like a scene from The Wolf of Wall Street. DiCaprio comes in and he's like, yeah, I'll sell this.
Yeah.
You have to learn fast. But that's the fun part I found about Silicon Valley. I didn't have a tech background, but I was fascinated by it. So my take was like, if I'm working with these tech companies, I immersed myself in the tech. I actually didn't hang out with the salespeople. I'd hang out with the engineers. And I'm like, make me understand Java. Make me understand what's an application server. Why do these app servers sit on top of databases? And like after 5, 6 o'clock at night, everyone's working late and they'd be drawing these diagrams saying, well, here's how this works, Mark, and here's our code, and here's what we're doing. For me, that helped me because then when I'm talking to an engineer, at some point, I could sit there in front of the room and say, okay, let's talk tech for a second. Let's talk about your environment. I'd be drawing something on a dry erase board. And it was like I think there was a moment in a meeting, I remember someone's like, Mark, where'd you get your computer science degree from? I smiled and I'm like, I don't have one. My engineer's here. She can answer any questions you have, but I just wanted to set the stage. And I realized like, I'm fascinated by this. I don't want to just be the salesperson. I want to understand the tech and then be able to help people.
That's so cool. I mean, it speaks volumes about your learner mindset or that drive to actually get to the bottom of anything that you're working on. That's pretty cool, Mark.
Yeah, it made selling a lot more fun. And then people could relate because they're like, okay, wait, you're not just here to sell. I'm like, no, let's talk. Like I always would start the meetings off with like, you guys talk first. What's the problem to solve? What's challenging? And maybe I can help and I will. And if not, it'll be a short meeting and we'll give you the time back.
You'd given the golden words to, engineers by actually listening to them because nobody listens to them.
I noticed that. It made me crazy. I'm like, these are the smartest people in the room. Like, I want to learn from them. So yeah, that's why tech was fun. Like all those different startups were all doing something unique. I had to cram the first few months from app servers to Java to big data, like all those things into security. It's like, okay, I'm going to learn fast and then I can have credibility talking about it.
That's so cool. So in this journey, did you think of Syndesus back then or was it conceptualized much later down the lane?
Much later, because all I thought of as I was working all these companies, first when you're younger, you're like, oh, these are amazing founders. They're doing something great. And then you get into your 30s and you're like, could I do that? No, I'm not technical, but I started hanging with my engineering friends. And for a while, we were like nights and weekends going through some problems. And I'm like, I'll be the business person. You guys solve a tech problem. And for a while, I was trying to do that. So I guess there's some point where I'm like, no, I don't need to work at someone else's startup. I need to have my own. But then it became, what is that idea? And so for the first couple of years, it's hanging out with friends who had tech companies, or we just be brainstorming on a problem to solve. So I think at some point you're in Silicon Valley, you're like, I can't work for other people all the time. What problem can I solve?
Yeah. So how many years later? I know that after this, you told us that you went to Canada, you did your grad school there. That was your introduction into Canadian immigration and exposure to that. Is that correct?
Yeah. So from 2003 to 2005, I went to Canada's top business school, Ivy School of Business. It's a 2-year program. My take was like, okay, I'm in Silicon Valley. I need to get an MBA. I got to go to a top 20 program. And this school was amazing because they have a unique way of teaching. It's the case method similar to Harvard and University of Virginia. So there are only 3 schools that do it. And I'm like, oh, this is wonderful. It's not basically being lectured at. It's walking into a classroom and the professor will be like, okay. He starts cold calling people. So it might be like, Rahul, you're up. Come to the front of the classroom. You did your research last night. The name of the game is the financial model for Chevron. Should they build a refinery should they build it in Saudi Arabia, build it in Texas, or not at all? And then everyone's staring at you and you'd be like, okay, my numbers show they should do it in Houston and here's why. And then it'd be like, okay, thank you very much. Then you get grilled by everyone, sit down. Next up, Mark, you're up. So you get cold called, but it's a method of learning where you're very involved. And I'm like, this is great. It's not just being lectured at. And maybe because I had some ADD and I was self-aware and I'm like, I need that lively kind of a classroom where things are going on. It's like rapid fire. And so it was perfect. And I actually went there because they had a new program. They're like, and it was a biotech focus, but they're like, you can go into life science. And I was like, okay, I think I'll get out of tech. I was fascinated by, there's a space called personalized medicine where it's like, instead of just prescribing drugs for everyone, it's like, what if we could figure out your personal DNA and how a drug would work in your body? And then I was just like, oh, apply tech to science and change the world. I remember thinking that that'd be a great thing to do after I graduated, go into companies that are in that space. But what I didn't realize, and thankfully, I don't know if anyone's had these experiences, but I talked to a bunch of alumni. These are people who are 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the space. And I'm like, hey, I'm fascinated by this. And every single one of them, sadly, said the same thing. They're like, oh, you're from Silicon Valley. You're used to things moving fast. You're used to like, that you can just dream it up and it happens. And they're like, this is life science. These are pharma companies. That doesn't move at that speed. You better be prepared for frustration and the FDA. And these are decades to get these drugs approved. Your innovation level doesn't exist here. You have to slow down. And after I saw that at some companies, I noticed that even during my internship that I did at a biotech company, after I graduated, I was like, no, I'm just going to go back. And I went back to Silicon Valley and got a job at a startup in Palo Alto. And I never looked back I've always been curious about life science, but I went right back to tech because that advice was sound. It was not the place where things move rapidly.
Your passion or fascination towards tech, was that just because of your innate desire to actually create change? Because I saw that when you mentioned life sciences, that same excitement and passion when you were talking about tech, I got a little bit of that. So was that what drove you to tech, is the fact that, hey, you know what, I can actually go ahead and make change and see that change and see how much it impacts people? Were you always someone who was driven by that kind of motivation or that feeling?
I was, but there's a downside to it because some of my friends were like, okay, Mark, you could be a sales rep. Some of them were going to Microsoft. Some of them were going to some companies that were well-funded, and they would share how much they were making. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And they're like, well, you're not really changing the world, but you're super well paid. And I'd be at some startup that, with 5 people with a technology no one ever heard of that maybe turns out didn't work because it's beta.
Okay.
And I'm just like, but I'm doing interesting work. And I'm like, but you're getting paid. And I kept doing it though, because for me, it's like, no, I didn't want to be at Microsoft. I didn't want to be at those big people like, oh, we can bring you over to Oracle. I'm like, I don't want to be there. They're not changing the world. It's just a job. So you're right. I always was drawn to like, what's the most fascinating problem and can I help solve it or bring it out to the market?
And I would also think it's probably also because rent was a lot more affordable in the Valley at that point in time. You didn't need a well-paying job then, right?
You're right. Like you see now, and I'm like, oh yeah, it could be dreamy back then, but not forever. You're right.
That's a very interesting perspective, Sanjay.
No, I mean, like in hindsight, obviously it's easy to say that now that, hey, you know what, things were easier back then. But the fact that I think at least somebody like me, even if it were that point in time, I would have to think 100 times before jumping into a startup route. And, the fact that I think you pretty much had an innate thing to go on these like exploratory modes, trying out the new stuff. It speaks volumes on what you're doing right now with Syndesus. And I think I'm seeing like a pattern. There's like, oh, you're slowly starting to find these new areas that's untested waters. And it's like, oh, I need to find out. And it's mostly satisfying your curiosity there, right? So
you're right.
And the common linking point is that no matter what Mark finds, he tries to connect that with tech. Like if it was the applied sciences, he's like, oh, tech and this, I can do this.
You can do this with tech. Yeah, you're right.
So it's like he's always on the lookout for new things. And it's like, hey, I could make an impact and change lives. Let me see how I can connect it with this and increase my leverage and help more people.
Yeah, that's a great insight.
Was that how you came across the need for Syndesus?
I think that the mindset I was having at that time that's around the time 2012, 2013. That's when I was hanging out with other engineering friends who were brainstorming to come up with ideas. I was like early 40s. I'm like, time's running out. It's time for me to swing at my company. I got to figure something out. So I was in the mode of looking for the idea, what it was. And the odd part was I never thought of a services company. I think through conversations with all my CTO friends, there were a few conversations where I had lived in, so I went to grad school, went back to Palo Alto, worked at a startup, then ended up living in Toronto for 3 years, another venture capital in Toronto, another startup, then moved back, the financial crisis, 2009, I moved back to California. I'm like, okay, coming back home. But that's when I started thinking, okay, I got to find my own idea to work on. But a few years later, I started comparing like, okay, maybe it's not tech. What if I did a services company? And I think I heard multiple friends talking about all the engineers in the Valley are so expensive, but we're up at 4 or 5 in the morning for our team in India. And they were frustrated by it because they're just like, hey, these hours are hard. What's a better way? And then I remember thinking like, I met a bunch of Canadians when I lived there that didn't want to move to the US and they were jealous of the people who moved and had the cool jobs. And I'm like, Canadians who want to stay in Canada but went to top schools like Waterloo, they want the cool jobs. What if I worked a remote deal out here? So then I mentioned that to different CTO friends and VP engineering friends. The response back, it was very quick because they're like, oh yeah, those engineers from Waterloo, or oh yeah, they're University of Toronto, like those really good schools. So right away there was an acknowledgement of like, oh, those are great engineers. But then people started saying things like, oh, but Canada's like France, you can't fire anyone. And I was just like, that's not true. I lived up there and I worked, and it's like it's not that crazy. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, I'm like, you have an angle, Mark. You lived there, but you're back home in California. You know the employment laws in Canada. You were there on work permits. You know there's a mentality of some Canadian workers who didn't want to move to the US because unlike Americans move all over the place, I noticed. Like I've lived all over North America. But a lot of Canadians, they're just like, no, this is my home. And I'm like, okay, you can work remotely for an American company. Let's rig this up. So I just fell into it. I'm like, this is my idea, but I had some experience. And there started Syndesus.
It's funny you mentioned the story. It's pretty much the typical, product market fit. You're talking to people finding this need for consumers, or in this case, engineering firms who are looking for candidates who don't want to deal with these time zones and all that stuff. And and I love the fact that theme pretty much presents like all throughout, what you've talked to us about your life. Like you started off at the Valley and then go out grad school, and it's like this full circle of life, right? It comes all together. It's great.
And what's interesting is the first idea of Syndesus was actually the opposite of, what is being served right now. It's cool that it's actually a two-way street, right? It was all about finding talent in Canada and connecting them with US tech employers here. I think that's what Mark started off with, right? And the evolution from there to now is also pretty fascinating.
Oh, you're right. Because in that case, it was people like, oh, you're like a recruiter. You're building engineering teams in Canada for VC-backed companies. I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm doing. But this is the advice I'd give to any startup founder. It's like, I see people analyzing and I'm like, only when you get into the game, the opportunities open up that you could never think of. So what did I think that recruiting thing would work out big? I was wrong. That was a painful business. You could do well one year, the next year, everyone like would cancel the contract at the last moment. And I'm like, how do people survive this way? Like,
yeah,
it was harsh. So one of my clients in New York, they're VC backed, did a 35-person team in Toronto. And one of their HR execs came to me and said, Mark, we have someone with a immigration issue in the US. Do you know anything about Canadian immigration? Is there any way we could move this person to Canada? I said, what's my biggest customer? Then I said, let me find out. I said, hold on, let me get back to you in 24 hours.
Okay.
So I called this Canadian immigration lawyer in Montreal and I said, I need your help. I had work visas several years back. And I remember it was complicated. There was paperwork and there was a lot of work to be done. I said, I just want to make sure it's the same process and maybe we can start it. And this immigration lawyer is like, Mark, I got a few questions for you. Is this a tech worker in the US? I'm like, yeah, they're a tech worker. He's like, do they have a tech degree or 1 year experience? I'm like, yes. He's like, they have salary over 86,000. I'm like, yes. And he's like, you're a Canadian corporation, right? You've been in business for over 3 years? I'm like, yeah, I've been in business for over 3 years. He's like, well, it's your lucky day. We have a new program here in Canada called Global Talent Stream. It's a new pilot program. Canadian government wants to bring in 200,000 highly skilled tech workers. And the questions I asked you are the parameters for whether someone qualifies. And I'm like, those are simple. He's like, that's the idea. It's supposed to be simple. So he's like, let's give this a shot. And the person gets in. Like in 4 weeks, it's all done. He's like, okay, Mark, that work visa is approved. In 4 weeks, they're on their way to Canada. I just stared at him and I was like, okay, that's great. Thank you. But then I went back to work and I'm like, that was helping a client. It's a one-off. What I didn't realize was I didn't know enough about the H-1B lottery and how disappointing it is. Because 6 months later, startup's founder in Silicon Valley emails me and says, Mark, I got to talk to you. And I pitched him on building a team in Canada. And I'm like, oh, good. You're ready for that team of engineers in Canada? He's like, well, no, someday. He's like, I have a different problem. One of our top engineers is from Mongolia, lost the H-1B lottery a third time. And we don't want him to go back to China. He's like, do you know anything about Canadian immigration? And I was like, yes. I'm like, do you need a work visa? He's like, yeah, can you get a work visa? And I'm like, and then employ the worker from Canada? I'm like, I just did that 6 months ago. And I go back to the same immigration lawyer. He's like, oh, another one. This one sounds great. Qualifies. So 4 or 5 weeks later, the work visa is approved. And then it dawns on me. I'm like, wait a minute. I think there's more people who need this service. And then I started asking more people in the immigration space. And then they're like, Mark, the US lottery, strike 3, 10,000 plus people every year. They go back to home country and they lose everything. And I was like, oh, and I've got this simple solution. And so then it was a matter of getting the word out. So Rahul, as you said, like it didn't start that way. It started as remote recruiting, and it still is. There's still people who come to me and say, I want to build an engineering team in Canada. But now when I hear that, what goes through my mind now is, okay, we can do that. But I also can pull from a pool of thousands of immigrants around the world, and I can bring them into Canada to work remotely for the Americans. And that's what I'm looking to scale up. It's like, I'm happy to help people who have U.S. immigration challenges. We've been doing it. We've moved dozens and dozens and dozens of people to Canada over the last 6 years. Love to keep doing that. But I think there's bigger opportunities.
I want to go back to when you mentioned where the first time you talked to a Canadian immigration lawyer and he mentioned this particular new program. Do you remember what year was that in?
It would have been late 2016 or 2017.
Yeah, because the equivalent of an American immigration lawyer saying you that there's a new scheme to bring talented folks might have been pre-1990, right? That is the last time there was any sort of reform to bring in talented people to the United States. And I'm just imagining the way Canadian immigration approaches things for, smart, skilled people. It's the 21st century and you're a smart person, you're a tech worker, whatever, you can work remotely, you meet these basic qualifications, we can get it done in 2 weeks. With the equivalent of, oh no, you got to go through a lottery that was designed in 1989. And there's only 80,000 visas. And if you lose it, that's it. You're gone. And it starts in October. It's completely random.
And Mark's surprised when he asked those 5 questions and he's like, that's it? That's pretty simple. And the lawyer's like, yeah, it's supposed to be. And USCIS are like, yeah, hold my beer.
and you're right, because I remember joking with the lawyer. I said, this is it. And then he was just like, yeah, he's like, this isn't the US, Mark. He's like, we do things differently here.
We've set the benchmark for shitty immigration everywhere. I'm telling you, it's not like US. That's a benchmark that we've set.
A global low benchmark, how you could do immigration wrong. For the smartest people in the world to tell them in 3 years, if you don't win a random lottery, you will leave the country forever.
Yeah.
And then the person's looking at their degree from University of Texas or Berkeley or MIT, and they're like, I'm going to leave. And we're like, yeah, you have to leave. It's ridiculous.
El Salvador has an immigration program right now, and they're saying if you don't get picked in the US lottery, come here and set up your shop. And that's selling it. There's so much tech interest for that. And I'm like, what's happening?
What are we doing?
Other countries are making money off of the fact that US immigration sucks so bad. That's how crazy it is. And we go back to this idea, right, with Syndesus, that you found it and you've solved it. And I would imagine maybe the first couple of firms that you worked with and you got the stuff running, the employees moved there, they've started working. What was their reaction once it's all done and dusted? We'd like to hear that.
I'll share both reactions. So first, there's the call where I'll have the HR exec from a US company. So the worker can't do the contract. The US company has to do the contract. So we'll have is usually the worker will call us first to understand how it works. Then we'll say, pull your manager in. And then it's always VP of people, VP of HR. There's someone who's filed the H-1B visa and they'll be on this call. And then the worker's there. And I did hundreds of these calls myself before I had built a sales team. So the company would say, okay, Mark, explain this program. I'm like, Canada's Global Talent Stream, I want 200,000 people in. Here's the parameters, degree, 1-year experience, Syndesus sponsors, been doing this. And then you see the HR person saying that's it. And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much it. And they're like, what's the success ratio? Low, single digit? I'm like, 99.9%. They only block people who have criminal records or medical problems that are significant. And you have to disclose that. And then the HR person's like, I've never heard of this. And I'm like, Canada, unfortunately, flies under the radar. Canadians aren't boisterous like Americans. They're not broadcasting this. They weren't back then. It's and then I'll turn to the worker and I'll say, look, I said, I lived in Canada 5 years as an American. I was there on student visas for 2 years. I was there on work visas for 3 years. I'm like, so it's personal. I lived there. And I'm like, it's just fine. Vancouver, Toronto, Calgary, all good cities. I said, here's how it's going to work for you from an immigration perspective. In 1.5 to 2 years, you will have sufficient points to get permanent residence, the Canadian green card, and probably about 4.5 years, you will be a Canadian citizen. I said, then in theory, as a Canadian citizen, you could come back to the US on TN visa, and then you could work for decades in the US.
Yep.
And then you see this blank stare from the immigrant tech worker saying, wait, 2 years? They're like, no, wait. So in the US, green cards are by country of birth. And I'm like, in the US,
yes,
that's how we do it here. We're the same people that came up with the H-1B program. We have a ridiculous green card program. that can put you in a decades-long wait. I'm like, Canada doesn't do that. It's about if you qualify, you get it. And then you see the company person saying, oh, I'm putting our person in a good space. They're going to be taken care of. They will have good immigration. They're not there as a guest worker, like in Singapore, maybe, or Dubai, where you're there your whole life and you have to leave. It's like, no, they will be permanent. Then all of a sudden the questions start coming from the worker. I'm like, do you want to talk to people who've moved? Canadian immigration lawyer will be on your next phone call. They'll spell all this out, but that's how this works. So you're asking what the reaction is. Then you see every single time both parties are like, let's do this. What I do is, and this is one of the favorite parts of being a founder of Syndesus, every few months I'll be in Canada, I'll have dinners with the people we moved up.
Oh,
and
wow.
Then you get 6 months, 1 year in. What I like to do is have someone who moved up 1 or 2 years earlier with the new arrivals. Then you'll hear someone say, I got my PR in 15 months. And then the other person's like, what? And they're like, oh yeah, just tell your immigration lawyer to do this and this on the application, or here's what I did. Mark told you 2 years, but we're getting them much faster. And the person, do you see someone taking notes? But then the person who's there just like, yeah, it worked. I'm fine. I'm set here. I got my permanent residence.
That's actually very nice of you to connect people like that and also just touch base with them after they moved.
It's great because you learn so much. Like even I was there in Toronto maybe 3 weeks back and I had lunch with someone we had moved 2 years earlier. So he's like, Mark, I got my permanent residence. He's a machine learning engineer. He's like, Mark, I've moved on from the company that we worked together on. I'm now working for some Silicon Valley company. I'm like, I hope you're well compensated. He's like, it's great. And I'm just like, good. It does work.
Nice. Yeah. So you're not tied to that one company for like decades.
Oh, that's the last question. It's interesting you said, Rahul. People say like, okay, Mark, are you going to sponsor my permanent residence? Are you going to sponsor my Canadian, I call it a green card, but because I'm an American, but it's Canadian permanent residence. I said, in Canada, the US, the company has nothing to do with your permanent residence. It's your personal choice. If you want to get permanent residence, you get an immigration lawyer. I'll introduce you to the best of the best. You will work with them. The company's not involved. It's you personally. Immigration is your personal business. The work visa is renewable, but in 2 years, you'll have PR. And again, you see someone sitting back, Rahul, and being like, you're not involved with it? I'm like, no, that's an American thing. That's American rules.
And Rahul, it goes back to this theme you were talking about the previous episode with Sindhu, right? Like we are so in this system in the US that we can't even think about the fact that, there's already a better design system in another country. Things like, your green card is not tied to employment, or it can be much better.
Because I had assumed one of the trade-offs is you've got to spend a considerable amount of time with the company that, you're partnering with, but that's insane.
No, I see it all the time. 1.5, 2 years in, the worker will call us and say, hey, I'm resigning. Hey, I got my permanent residence. I'm like, cool. Let us know if we can help you in the future. And because we're employer of record, what we always tell them is if you get a job with another American company and they don't know how to employ you legally in Canada and they don't want to do a contractor arrangement, they want you to be an employee and have health care and have all the taxes paid. We have an employer of record service. We can help you into the future. Anytime you get a cool American job, introduce the U.S. company to us, we'll make sure that arrangement's in place. You can be a consultant if you want or a contractor, but employment is always a little bit easier from a tax perspective. So we have people coming back saying, and that's my personal bias, I know the U.S. companies pay the most and the biggest opportunities are in the U.S. So I tell people, go to Canada for the immigration, but get a remote job in the U.S. for the pay and for the experience. Best of both.
You said you deal mainly with employers, not employees. How much does it cost impact to an employer to do something like this?
Yeah, and Rahul, that's one of the hardest parts of this discussion because 90% of the time we're talking to the worker. So someone may be listen to this podcast and be like, that's me. My third try in the lottery was this year. OPT is expiring December 13th. I'm out of options and I want to keep this job. We always say the worker would come on and interview and talk to our sales team. We'll walk them through everything. But we always say, like, get your employer on the call. But what the hardest part about this is we'll tell the worker the price. And sometimes you see the worker say like, oh, and then they stop right there. What they don't realize is now that I've worked with HR execs for years, what they spell out to me is they're like, Mark, the amount of fees we spent in legal fees, we set aside $15,000 to $25,000 per person for H-1B and then eventually for green cards. Or like we put the money aside and we're going to keep going. It's not a one-time shot. We will do what it takes. And what they've also shared with me is they said, I've asked them, it's a common number in HR. When you ask, what's the replacement cost for a worker who leaves, who's been with you for a few years? The standard number of any tech company would say is $50,000 to $100,000 because there's the recruiting cost to hire the worker, which could be $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. Then there's the years of experience to get them ramped up. And so what I feel sad many times because the worker's like, oh, but I'm trying to make things easy on my employer and you're going to charge them. I'm like, the cost of you leaving is triple what we're charging them. I've never had an HR person. I was negotiating with the chief financial officer. He's like, so what's the price, Mark? And I was like, 15,000 US. And he's like, oh, okay, wow. And I said, what's your plan to replace this worker? Because in 3 months, they're going to leave the US and you said you're going to have to terminate them. And he literally says, hold on a second, Mark. He had some kind of a speakerphone and he's like, let's call the recruiter. And he calls us, he hits HR and he's like, Susan, I got a question. What we're going to pay the recruiter? And she's like, 15,000 was the budget for the recruiter. And he's like, thank you. And he gets on the phone. He's like, all right, let's negotiate. I have a CFO. I have to negotiate with you. I said, of course I'll negotiate with you. But right away, he's like, I would rather pay that money to keep the person.
Yeah.
Than get a new person, start all over.
And that's a gamble too, right? If the new person's not a fit, you've just lost that money and you go back to the drawing board.
You go back again. So yeah, that's what we tell the client. And so we will work it out. Like some companies like, hey, can you do a payment plan or can we stretch this out? I'm like, of course we can. And there's another surprise. It's sometimes the worker will be in Silicon Valley or New York and I'll talk to the HR exec. I'm like, what are you paying in healthcare per month? And they're like 1,500 or 1,700 for the employer contribution. I'm like, when they go to Canada, that goes away. And you could use that money to put us in a payment plan. And you see the HR person's like, that could work. You quickly make the calculation. So the companies have no problem with the payment structure. The worker gets scared thinking, I'm going to insult my manager by asking for them to do this. But they don't realize it's like, no, you're so valuable to the company that we can work all that stuff out behind the scenes.
To all the listeners tuning in, that's actually a really good point. Like, I know that when we're on a visa here, especially from an immigration standpoint, we often walk on eggshells, trying not to inconvenience our employers too much, thinking that, hey, how are they going to receive it? But you've just heard it firsthand from Mark. He's got the data to back it up. If you are in a predicament like this, don't hesitate. I'm sure you can have a preliminary call with Mark and his team to understand how to present it to your employers. Mark, is that a fair statement to say?
We always take the call first with the worker. Always do that.
So you've heard it firsthand now that they would prefer to keep you on and do whatever they can rather than try to replace you by spending a lot more money. So don't hesitate. And something a mentor once told me is the worst thing you can hear is a no, right? If you've not asked a question, it's already a no. If you've asked it, there's a probability that it could be a yes. And if that's something that I've tried to live by. So ask. And if you present it well, it could swing in your favor.
It could. And I want to share one exception. I have had a policy, never charge the worker. Ever, ever, never. I think that's evil. And so what we always say is, look, your company's paying for everything. There is one rare exception. Someone came to my team late last year and said, we were asking what their salary, and they said like 200,000 US. And I'm, okay, Silicon Valley or New York. And then they said, for whatever reason, their employer's like, I don't know. I don't know if I can do this. And the worker actually came to us and said, I'm going to leave the US and lose everything. This is my dream job. This company is great. Everyone's great. And their plea to us was, I don't have to make 200,000. I could go to 180. But this is a chance for me. And this worker said, I talked to Canadian immigration. I can be a permanent resident in 2 years. I'll be a citizen in 4. And their plea to us was, this is my life. Like, I want this. And so my team's like, so do we still say no? And I was like, how do you say no to that person? How do you say no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to make an exception. And in this case, we did. We went to the employer and they said, okay, 200 down to 180. And the company's like, we'll do that. And we'll just shift the savings over and then we'll pay for the program. That's the only exception we'd make where it's like a highly compensated worker is saying, do this for me. This is my last chance. I don't want to go back to home country and lose everything, including this great job. That's the only time we'd make an exception.
And it's really interesting you say this, Mark, because Sanjay, you remember how we ended Sindhu's episode? The price for freedom, right? We were trying to, how do you justify moving from a high-paying job in US to making a little lesser in Canada? And Sindhu said, I have a thought exercise for everybody. Think about your life here and, the constraints that you have, and think about the freedom that you want. What value would you assign to that freedom, right?
Yeah.
That's the cost differential that you're going to have when you go from this, and see if it makes sense when you want to move it or not. And you saying that just now, it just reminded me of that. And it was almost the exact same thing what she said, what this client of yours did.
Exactly, right? It goes back to this person's willing to cut down and taper down their salary expectations every year, like as long as they're employed with that company, just so that they can trade that off with not having to deal or stress with any of this stuff anymore.
Yep.
Sanjay, there's a price for that stress. That's what I heard over the years of people coming to me. They're like, Mark, the uncertainty, it eats at you. And then when we get to Canada, all of a sudden, I'm not worried about, I have other concerns. I move on to other concerns.
Yeah.
But I'm no longer worried about like OPT expiring. Is this going to work out? It's like, we just move on. And they're like, they'll pay for that. I will take a hit for that financially because you can make it up later. It's no problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, following your hobby, a side hustle, being able to sleep at night, I trade all of these in for,
I trade just for the last one, right? Just the ability to sleep at night and wake up and not have to worry about my visa status.
Yeah. Being able to take a mental health break. Hey, I'm overwhelmed. I want to just take some time off, take a month off. It's impossible on a visa.
Exactly.
No one at USCIS is going to understand that. Hey, you're overwhelmed. Oh, okay, go back to your own country. I'm like, okay, thanks. Since you've spoken about employer flexibility, Mark, it's great. It's such an amazing option. And everything seems to be, structured the way it's supposed to be structured. But have you faced any challenges?
All the time.
All the time? Okay.
There is the entrepreneurial roadmap. The journey is hard. So building an employer of record business, challenging. The HR rules in Canada are different. They are very slanted towards the employee. So, sometimes a friend will be like, oh, you have that payroll business. It's pretty straightforward. And I'm like, oh, no. No, I employ some very smart HR execs in Canada who help make sure that we're compliant. The Canadian laws are different. There's a learning curve there. That part's been difficult. Like for as good as Canadian immigration has been for that part of the business, that's been the welcoming part. But running a business, I'm basically running an HR business according to Canadian rules. Canadian rules are complicated. They are not the US. In the US, you hear an employer will call us up and say, oh, we changed our mind on so-and-so worker. Like if they had a Canadian worker, we'll terminate them and give them 2 weeks. And I'm like, they've been with you for 4 years. It's not Texas. I know you guys are in Dallas. You're not going to be giving them 2 weeks. We're going to come back to you and let you know what's owed. We shared that with you in the contract up front. There's no surprises, but it's not 2 weeks. It's not employment at will. And we'll let you know what you have to pay. So to maintain that, there's been challenges. So growing fast, hiring people, all that's been plenty of challenges. Like I have a lot of ambitions to build a much, much bigger company. I've moved over 100 people to Canada. I'm working on plans to move 10,000. But to do all that, there's a lot that'll be an interview on a different time as I'm going to be raising angel money for that. But I want to help immigrants in a much bigger way. But yeah, to answer your question, there's been a lot of challenges along the way. But that's part of the entrepreneur's journey. Like it is going to be hard.
And some of them are good problems to have from growing a business standpoint.
They are. It's learning. It's 10 years now since I started the company.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so from that point, I look at the team I have and all the smart people who work for us and how dedicated they are. I'm like, this is good, not just good, this is great, but a tough journey and lots of harsh lessons, a lot of them. And every time I talk to an entrepreneur, they're like, oh, you too, Mark? Welcome to the club. This is how it works. Oh, you didn't like that setback? You didn't like how that went for you and that hard lesson, how much that cost you? Yeah, it happened to all of us. I'm like, okay, I think I feel a little better, but it's still hard.
You could have warned me, but okay.
Yeah, you could have warned me. Why did you say something 5 years ago?
That's pretty cool. I'm going to pick on one line that Sanjay said about coming full circle. And Mark, I feel like in some ways, from what I know of you and how we connected before, Syndesus is helping immigrants, giving them an entry into Canada. In some way, for you, from a family history or legacy point, it's come full circle, like Sanjay said, hasn't it?
Steve Jobs said something about in one of his famous speeches of like connecting all the dots, but looking backwards, not forwards. So for me, my father grew up in Germany. He ended up behind the Iron Curtain when the Russians took over. He had a PhD from the top universities in Germany, Göttingen, Max Planck.
Wow.
Him and my grandmother escaped over the wall. They found a way out. Sitting there, and now they got into Western Germany, and with all his degrees, he couldn't get to the US. He's like, Mark, there was no way to the US. But he found that Canada was taking immigrants in. So he moved to Canada as a PhD student, went to University of British Columbia, worked there in postdoc work for a year research. Then another scientist in the University of Toronto says, oh, come work with me. So he moves to the University of Toronto for a year, works there. Then after 2 years in Canada, then he has the opportunity to go to the US, moves down to New Orleans. then moves over to UCLA, then joins the U.S. Defense Department. Then for 38 years, he ends up doing top secret laser research for the Defense Department. And for him, it was like the ultimate career. But then all of a sudden, I didn't know it at the time, but we'd go from San Diego, we'd end up like in British Columbia, like going to Banff or the ice fields in Jasper. We do these camping trips up there. And I was like, why are we going all the way up here? And then I didn't get it when I was a kid, because it's like you just go because you're supposed to. And that's where the family's going. But only later did he tell me, he's like, with his German accent, he's like, Mark, British Columbia is the most beautiful place in the world. And he would say that, but then we would go on trips there. And then I started going there as an adult, and I'm like, yes, it is. And then you mentioned full circle. In the last years of his life, he passed away at 95, he passed away during COVID, but he got to see me launch this business.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, I thanked him I said, your journey affected me. I said, your immigrant's journey, I never realized this, set me on a path that I never saw. And so I guess it's been ingrained in me, and I didn't know it, that Canadian immigration isn't a fad. It's been welcoming. It's not like one party likes it and one doesn't. Both parties are in favor. It's just part of their DNA. So now when I'm having this business, maybe it's not a surprise. Maybe it's, I guess, that experience that my father had as an immigrant, it carries on the next generation. And so now I have an opportunity, probably in other words, I have a responsibility to help other immigrants. And that's what I mentioned. I've helped 100 plus people move. I'm looking much, much bigger. I want to help a lot more people. And I think Canada has a really unique system.
Yeah, that's such a heartwarming story, Sanjay.
I've been thinking, we don't talk about religion or spirituality on this podcast, but in Hinduism, there's this concept of karma. You do certain things and you don't worry about the actions. I just found it interesting when you were talking about this, very personal story. Thank you for opening up. Is the idea is I feel in some way you are doing that karmic work of the benefits your father received from Canada, by bringing these skilled immigrants there and helping them out in your own way. I don't know if it's all interconnected or if it's just, a random roll of the dice, but if there is, it definitely feels that way from your story, Mark.
I like to think it's connected.
Yeah.
And if I think back to my father's a PhD and the effect he had on the US government and the work he did, and I think of some of these AI specialists, people with machine learning backgrounds, some of the people we've moved, and now I'm thinking, how can I bring the best of the best AI students, China, Pakistan, India, all around the world, help them come to Canada to work remotely for US companies? That's one of my bigger visions. I get to help everyone. I get to help US industry. I get to help the immigrant worker themselves. I can change their lives. But right now, this is what the US needs. We need the best of the best, and our immigration system isn't friendly. So I'm going to find a way to do this.
That's awesome. You're carrying your dad's legacy forward. I'm sure he's extremely proud of you and all the things that you've done. And also, on behalf of all the internationals here who's been struggling with this and that you've helped or you want to help in the future, huge thank you. You've no idea how reassuring it is to know that such options exist.
Exactly.
Because we've got close to 500,000 people applying for H-1Bs every year.
Every year.
And if you think about it, this year we had comparatively better, with almost 18% approval. People got through.
It's not a good result, but it's better than before.
It was 10 or 11 last year. Yeah. And I keep thinking, and I put out this annual rant on LinkedIn. It's countless dreams are just destroyed, right? Because you got people scraping together every penny they've got, taking loans, coming here, trying to make a living. And every year, all those dreams are shattered and they have nothing else to do except, hey, pack up and go back or try to figure out some other options which might not even be financially appealing or in their best interest. So thanks for this. And
the thing is, you and I, we've been through some of the stuff, and I don't know about you, Rahul, but I had no idea if something like this existed in the first place, and that would have been a whole different story. And so the idea that you're doing this is fantastic, and we are hoping that whoever listens to this conversation, if you are a bit worried and you're a great, valuable employee for your firm, I would absolutely at least get the conversation started with Mark, because you don't lose anything. You just lose a few minutes. Just get the conversation going, understand your options, and you can take it from there.
And especially for tech companies with all the scrutiny on perm filings now, I feel like even if you do get your H-1B, nothing is certain on whether your perm will get filed within your 6 years or
You're right.
anything else after that. So even if you've been successful in your lottery, you might find yourself looking at Syndesus as an option. One final question though, Mark. Is this only for tech workers, as in an IT tech worker, or can any STEM discipline approach Syndesus to see if this Canadian route is an option for them?
It's focused on STEM, but that can be a bit broad. So, for example, it's not just, unfortunately, the hardware scenarios don't work because most companies will say if you're a hardware engineer, you're working in a lab. And I did see one person who had their equipment sent to them in Toronto that we moved.
Oh, wow.
And it was enough that could be FedEx, but there was some equipment sent and they're like, no, the work is transportable. But otherwise, it's usually software. But that's broad because some people said, like, Mark, what about a data scientist? I'm like, qualifies. Product manager with a technical degree qualifies. There's a whole section set aside for the manager. So like a VP of engineering, a head of engineering. So if you're the management of a technical team, you would qualify. And then there is a separate, their version of an O1 of extraordinary talent. They do have a version for that. So we say tech roles, tech STEM, but then it's opened up to product managers, data scientists. Where it's not opened up is if you're an MBA and a business person, like you're just doing your pure business, or you're a consultant, no tech background, or marketers. Unfortunately, we see people like that, and I'm like, that's not going to work. But business analysts do. What I've learned is never, and my team is very good about this. They don't make the decision. If they're like, we're not sure, we just reach out to our team of Canadian immigration lawyers, the people we've trusted for over half a decade, and they'll surprise us sometime. They'll be like, wait, this person has a tech degree. It's a business analyst role. Actually, they'll fit here. And I'm like, oh, good. So there's hope if it's STEM or tech-focused area like the ones I mentioned.
Oh, that's good to know.
And again, I want to highlight the fact that the Canadian immigration law is like, oh yeah, this is a mixed case. We can make this work. With USCIS, it's the other way. Oh, never mind. Don't bother with this approach. I can't find the right word for it, but it's sort of like, oh, hey, if there's any way we can get this person, yeah, we can find a way to do it. With the US, it's like, if this doesn't meet these exact requirements, that's it. You're a goner.
I mean, US is very black or white, right? I feel like Canadian immigration is more like, hey, you can't really fit everything into a certain fixed number of buckets. We'll look at it case by case and take a call.
Yeah, I mean, Canada understands immigration is about immigrants, The US sees immigration as, a rock, paper, scissors game.
Agree.
But yeah, thanks so much, Mark. We loved having you on the episode. And, I might be pushing my luck a little bit, but do you have anything interesting for, our listeners that make use of, like, maybe a discount or something like that?
Absolutely. And thanks for mentioning that, because we're happy to do something for, like I mentioned, the price of what we charge, and we're always flexible. We negotiate with companies.
Yeah.
But for your listeners, absolutely, there'd be a discount. I think that's a great idea, and we're happy to do so, because I'm thankful to both of you, because as you said earlier, almost no one knows this exists. So Rahul, Sanjay, just sharing this possibility, there is someone listening who's like, I thought it was over, and the Syndesus team looks like they have something for me. I don't have to lose everything. I don't have to lose my dream job. Might get an umbrella because it rains a lot in Vancouver, might have to buy a heavy coat for Toronto because it's cold. But as your previous guest, Sindhu, says, it describes her experience there. And I've met her a couple of times in Toronto. She's wonderful. You can build a good life there. So I'm appreciative to both of you to having me on to share this message and share this solution. It works, and it can work for many people.
Well, thanks again for coming and spending some time to talk with us, Mark. And we're all very appreciative of what you do. And we hope Syndesus, reaches great heights and you hit that 10,000, 100,000 mark very, very soon.
I hope so too.
Hope to see you back on the podcast very soon. Thank you.
Would love that. Thank you both.
Thanks, Mark. That's quite a story, yeah? I mean, aside from what Syndesus does, I felt like Mark's personal story and,
that was awesome.
Right? It's pretty crazy. Like,
he's carrying that forward. It's probably ingrained in his DNA already. His dad did all this.
Right?
And he came to that realization. And I don't know, I found that last part kind of drove it home for me and kind of, like I said, he did reach full circle with his startup. I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? He spent his whole life looking for like ideas and options and stuff. The inspiration was right there at home. Think about it.
Exactly. I mean, that's the thing. Like, you're curious behind an idea and it keeps bothering you, and like finally, this is the thing. It's super cool. Yep.
I mean, that aside, I feel like this is a great method for folks, a good alternative for folks who've not been successful in either H-1B's lottery or their perm after that. Because 2 years in, 3 years in, you get your PR. You can get your Canadian citizenship after that. And if you still want to come back to US, you have that option on a TN visa.
Exactly.
And I think if you're even approved I-140 before that, even better, you can pick up where you left off. And just that you have another safety net underneath you.
Yep,
just
exactly.
Go to Canada if something happens.
And of course, I've heard like the Toronto food scene is pretty awesome as well. So
yes,
so
absolutely.
But yeah, I feel it was great, very informative, very educative. Because like I had no idea about this earlier. It's definitely something like if you're in a position where you're not sure things are going to go your way, you can definitely connect with Marc. And we'll add it in our show notes on how you can reach out.
Yeah.
Yep.
And as always, we keep trying to bring out content that might be helpful for you guys. So if you liked the Canadian series, I think it's the second episode we're doing on going to Canada now. Reach out, drop us a note. As always, we love hearing from you guys. And if you've got any ideas on potential future episodes, send us a note as well. A few episodes we've done in the past have all been recommendations from you guys. And we look forward to these because there's only so much that Sanjay and I can think of and do it at a point in time. So you add more perspective to this journey. And so we hope to hear more from you. And as always, thanks for tuning in.
Yep. Take care, folks.